All right then, everyone, we're on a roll now. We're on a roll. And I've got our third merchant talk in a row now for you. Thank you. And next up, we have Matt Medlyn, who is Head of Ecommerce at Graham & Green. They're an eclectic emporium of treasures for your home. I'm sure you might be familiar with their monkey lamps, for example. Matt's an e-commerce industry veteran with over 20 years of experience. So once again, another merchant speaker who's bringing a lot of real-world insight, real-world lessons for you today. Okay, so please give a warm welcome to Matt.
Thank you. Oh, lordy, lordy, lordy. Can you all hear me okay? Hey. Thank you, everybody, to coming to, theoretically, could be quite a boring talk. Thank you to JH for inviting me to speak. I used to do this a lot. I haven't done it for about 6 years. So let's hope I still can. But firstly, a bit of a disclaimer. Despite what Jamie Huskinson says, this is a talk about Google Tag Manager. And I am aware I am at an Adobe event. So I just want to make it absolutely clear, other tools are available. And I'm sure an Adobe representative would love to talk to you about them. But firstly, a bit about Graham Green. As just said, we are a homewares and furniture brand. We're coming up to our 50th anniversary. I've been their head of e-commerce for 4 years. I've been a client of JH's for 4 years. There's a couple of people I work with at JH over there. I would wave to them, but if they wave back, they'd probably have to bill me. But a bit about me. As I said, I've been in e-commerce for 20 years. I know I don't look it. But what I'm most well known for is the 10 years I spent as the head of e-commerce at Lovehoney. Hopefully, you know what Lovehoney do. And it was a bit of a shock, quite frankly, going from sex toys to furniture and homewares. But I guess it still does involve knobs and knockers. But I need to crack on. I've got 56 slides and 20 minutes to do it in. So let's talk about GA4. It's been fun, hasn't it, implementing GA4? But in its defense, GA4 is not awful. Fundamentally. It's essentially espoused the idea of sessions, which means it's got rid of the idea of a bounce rate, which was always a bit noddy. But this can't overcome the fact that it is really poorly documented. If you want great GA4 documentation, don't go to Google, go to a guy called Simo Ahava. And the interface is terrible. It's actually painful to use, which is why I do a lot of my analysis actually in BigQuery here. And because GA4 now largely works off events and parameters events, analyzing it is actually quite easy. And you can do fun stuff in Looker Studio. You can get rough approximations of the reports you used to use in old UA. You can even drag external data into a cloud storage bucket and use that as an external source. If you want to, and you're feeling adventurous, you can use LookML to create custom data objects and custom view objects, and it's great. The problem is, this is Barry and Brenda. They run your local farmshop.co.uk, and they understood virtually none of the words that left my lips but moments ago. GA4 is hard. Integrating GA4 was hard, which is why we, like a lot of retailers, took the coward's way out and installed the VeltPixel GA4 module. Relatively easy to implement. And so ultimately, our analytics setup hasn't massively changed. We've got Magento that serves a website to a client browser. There's bits of JavaScript that throw data to GA4. And the Pro version of VeltPixel supports measurement protocol, which is like a server-to-server connection. So if, for any reason, Google Analytics is blocked by the browser, you'll still get your e-commerce events and your purchases sent up to GA4, albeit in an anonymized way. Isn't that cool? Isn't that super cool? No. No, it's not. It's boring. It's boring and it's useless, and I will tell you why. As we all know, people use multiple devices when shopping. I don't know why she's smiling. Maybe she's looking at puppies. But they use multiple devices for browsing. So they'll be in bed on their mobile, thinking about buying something, and they'll go onto their desktop the following evening to make their purchase. But the problem is, when people visit your site from a new device, you're essentially playing an elaborate game of guess who. You know, I go onto your site on one device, I come back without my glasses on and a funnier mustache, and you don't know who I am. So VeltPixel comes along and says, hey mate, it's all right, I've got this covered. All I need is for people to log into your site, and I'll use the Magento customer ID as a user ID for GA4. I'll pass that to GA4, and GA4 will link up all your sessions. All I need them to do is log in. So let's talk about the login. And by that, I obviously mean the log in. Just north of Evansville, Indiana, it's a downtown eatery, whatever that means. And on the Graham Greene website, much like the login north of Evansville, Indiana, hardly anyone ever goes there. But it's okay, says Google. What I can do is I could use things like their Google account. Are they logged into their Google account? And I can use that to join sessions. If not, I can model this stuff for you based on previous data. And I think I have to go think, well, yeah, I've always trusted Google. I've trusted Google to do this as well. Google knows what it's doing. Lies. They're liars. Lying bag of lies. And I know this for a fact, because I've been thinking about what users actually do. This is Ametria. It's our ESP, email service provider. Other tools are available. But what Ametria does is that it can link mobile and desktop behavior. And it does this quite simply. When someone clicks through from an email, they append an Ametria ID to the URL, which then gets stuffed in a cookie. And I can retrieve that ID relatively easily with a simple getIdentity function. Wouldn't it be cool if I saved that user ID as a variable and passed that to GA4? So I do. So we've now got two GA4 accounts, the old one, which is VeltPixel with Magento user ID, and the new one that's served by server-side tag manager that takes the Ametria ID, does a switcheroony, and passes it as a user ID to GA4. What's the results of that? Here's some hard figures for you. So everything else has stayed the same. Consent management has stayed the same. Tag priority has stayed the same. But when I pass the Ametria user ID, I get over 10% less new users reported in GA. And the fact that new users has dropped more than the overall users means GA4, the original GA4, was counting some users at least 3 times as new users. Google is lying. I touched a little bit about server-side GTM. If you haven't played about with server-side GTM, please do. It's quite easy to spin up an instance. It took me about 2 hours. The Facebook tag is weirdly quite cool. It actually accepts GA4 data objects and converts them automatically into Facebook data objects. You don't have to configure or program anything. But now we're tracking all this data. What fun things can we see and do with it? So let's start with a simple question. What is the worst thing that can happen to a product? Well, that was a rhetorical question because I've got a slide. These are the 3 worst things that can happen to a product. The first thing is that that product is fractured. And fracturing means you've got, say, a t-shirt that comes in 5 sizes and 3 different colors, but the majority of those sizes and colors are sold out. So what you can do, you can take the number of out-of-stock options, divide it by the total number of options, and that is your fracture rate. The next in severity worst thing that can happen to a product is that it's out of stock, obviously. If it's out of stock, people can't buy it. And ideally, you're tracking this stuff anyway in some kind of sales velocity system. But if you don't, you can take out of stocks and pass that to GA4 as well. But the absolute worst thing that can happen to a product is that it is lonely. A lonely product that has never been viewed. Sad times. Problem is, of course, is that GA4 and other analytics tools, that they track things that do happen, not things that don't happen. So how do you get any visibility of this stuff? Well, it's quite easy. You can take, this is a really boring slide, I do apologize. What you can do is take a standard Magento product export. If you've got multiple stores, you'll need to flatten it down, but with a little bit of filtering, you can get a list of every URL that should have at least one view over a certain time period. And then if you cross-reference that with your view item event in GA4 and the page location of that event in GA4, you can get a list of stuff that over whenever you're looking at it has never been viewed. And I like to use this as an early warning system, essentially. More often than not, it's a categorization issue. Has it in fact been categorized at all? But it means that I get to see these issues before merchandising even get a look in. Another system we use is Noibu. Noibu is a front-end error tracking system. It's quite expensive. You might have a similar tool like Rollbar or Sentry or something like that. But if you don't, you can kind of get this stuff on the cheap in GTM. GTM has a built-in JavaScript error trigger. It's got built-in JavaScript error variables. And you can pump all this stuff into GA. And so you can see what are the most frequent errors that appear on my site. And with a bit of segmentation, you can see, what are the things that affect conversion the most. But these aren't the only errors that can happen on a site. For example, this error here, which is the sort of error that someone sees in the checkout if they've made an issue with the payment details. And again, quite easy to track. We just have an element visibility for that error message. We know the string, we know the page. We can send that up to GA4. But again, that's not the only error that can happen on a site. These. We live in a cost of living crisis. And I think any retailer here will have a shared experience that the number of discount codes people are using has increased. Often I'll watch session recordings and people will just bash in code after code till one works. And so if I take that invalid code and pass it to GA, I can see the codes that are most frequently classified as invalid when someone is using them. They might be invalid because there's a spend threshold for them to work. But you can pass the basket value up if you wish. But my favorite thing to do is to look at the page referrer for these codes. So who's giving these codes to people? And more often than not, it's a misbehaving affiliate, as if there was any other kind, promoting old and expired and invalid codes. But now that we have this data, what can we do with it? And I would like to introduce you to the concept of scratch tags. And scratch tags are little bits of JavaScript that you serve with GTM that scratch a particular itch that you have. They can be quick fixes, and I am guilty as anything, and thank God Matche is using it in a different track, because he would be very cross. I use them to make little fixes on the site, but they're also handy for rapid prototyping of ideas, if you need to show something on a live site, what something would look like. But anyway, we want to do a scratch tag. How can we use it? So if you remember the checkout error message, we're tracking it, we've got a trigger. Why don't we fire something to rewrite the error, to be more useful and help the customer along. And again, if you segment all this stuff in GA, you can look at the recovery rate for those errors, how many people were able to place their order after getting it. If you remember the coupon codes, people are trying to enter invalid coupon codes, and they get the world's worst error message. So why don't we rewrite that as well? And you can write the world's longest case statement, or if you're good, write a regex that will understand what code is trying to be used and give a better error message. And even better, if you look at the bottom, what you can do is offer a consolation prize code, which means they're not then going to go hunting around for a different discount code, and they stay on your site. And even better to that, if you add that consolation prize code to your list of disallowed codes for affiliates, they don't get paid for that traffic and that purchase. That'll teach them. But there might be reasons people actually are trying to enter a valid code, but is giving an error message. A good example of that is something like an abandoned basket email, especially if you're using an auto-generated code, and they tend to be quite complex. But you know the code that's being used. You know that link in that email is going to the basket. So why don't you help them along and auto-apply the discount code for them? This is quite an old scratch tag. You can tell because I use jQuery and I've learned better since. But you can help them along the process. Now, GTM isn't really just to help users along. You can also use it to help Google. Specifically, using it for SEO purposes. Now, I'm going to show you a very boring slide that you probably won't be able to read. This is Google's suggested meta for a product page, essentially describing what that product is. And product meta isn't just the name and the image and, if you're lucky, the price. It's all sorts of things. So it could be the returns policy that you have. It could be how much shipping is, the GTIN, the brand, whatever. And sometimes this will be out of the box. Is it out of the box in Magento? No, because it's Magento. I thought with this, why does it have to be on the product page? Couldn't this be on the product listing page instead? Because you know all this information. You know what your shipping costs are. You know what your return policy is. So why don't you just output all this onto a product listings page? It's not hard, just add a bunch of item prop attributes. And this is the results of that work. Because Google understands a lot more about our products much, much quickly, it's learning about our products from one page rather than crawling hundreds. We're now getting a lot more traffic for long-tail keywords, about 1,000 to 2,000 more rankings for it. And in this chart on the left, you can see when we started doing this, which was kind of pretty basic, product image, product name, the offers meta. Then the next big jump is when I added shipping policy and returns policy. And the jump after that was when Jason at JH hard-coded that for me. And the hard coding bit is important because I have a warning for you. And I know what you're thinking. I've just spent 15 minutes espousing adding a whole bunch of code onto your site. But let me tell you a story. Back when I was at university, I worked for the student television station. And our VHS tape-to-tape editor, VHS, it's like TikTok, but in like a box and longer. Our VHS tape-to-tape editor broke. It had an electrical fault. And we were able to fix it using chewing gum and Kit Kat wrappers. And did it work? Yes. Did it work well? No. Which means you are adding a little bit of instability into your site, which means when something goes wrong, there is essentially a massive finger-pointing game between me and the developers about which one of us broke it. But with Google Tag Manager, there's at least a way of testing all this and checking all this stuff. It's quite easy in Chrome to stick network request blocking on and just exclude Tag Manager entirely, and then you see your vanilla site. But instability isn't the only problem when you're introducing code like this. You need to think about how long it takes for that code to execute. There's a great talk about Lighthouse later on. But one thing I look at is the total blocking time and has it increased that. Unfortunately, Google Lighthouse uses the Moto G4 Plus to simulate this effect, and it is the world's worst phone. So take this as a pinch of salt and use it as a comparative metric. The other issue when you're adding code is that there's a performance overhead. And so I like to look at the performance analyzer and look at long tasks or any of these purple blocks, which means I have essentially bucketed up. But I'm afraid, much like Google, I have lied to you. You may have noticed by the astonishing lack of technical detail, this isn't really a talk about Google Tag Manager. This is actually a talk about users and user data, and how you can use user data for fun and profit. So we talked about the game of Guess Who, and more importantly, using passive identification to be able to link sessions together. We talked about the error messages, the actual things that a user experiences on your site and tracking that stuff. We talked about nudging them along. Now that you're tracking this stuff, how can you move them to the next step in the funnel? And finally, we talked about the gaps in your data. What your users don't do is just as important as what they do. And you need to figure out what you aren't seeing, what your customers aren't and aren't doing, and use that for profit. Thank you.